Okay, welcome to Stampscaping 101. This is going to kind of cover some of the basics, but they're basics that really come into play with certain types of images, and that is the aspect of impression pressure over whatever given amount of surface area that you happen to be using with certain designs, okay? Here's this little, I don't know, I guess it was a composition, but I'll show you in this video of how to get the correct impression pressure on your stamps, to avoid kind of these more kind of squashed areas or parts of images within a given area, okay? And it comes up periodically. And I used to see it in my workshops quite a bit, and I do mention this in a lot of my videos, but this one's just a kind of a dedicated video, in regards to this aspect of stamping, okay? But, when you get to, I don't know, some smaller images like this, it's always important to adjust your pressure when you're stamping your objects. This is kind of the correct pressure right here, and you can see these kind of more extreme versions of it. And we've all kind of run into it before. And this is a video that will kind of go into how to assess your stamp or your areas within your stamps, and to think about it in terms of where to utilize your pressure when making those impressions. It really comes into play too, like various scenic stampings too, or something like this. Let's say where I've stamped this image out, like amongst this kind of area with a lot of saturated tones or something like that. Sometimes in the end process of stamping out some kind of subject matter, a little bird in the sky too. Sometimes if you're doing this kind of layered dye-based glossy paper technique, you can almost be stamping out kind of a wet object into a wet area, if you've just freshly applied a lot of inks down there. So it applies to something like that too, and I do mention it in all my videos, but I decided to make a dedicated video in regards to this kind of aspect of stamping. So kind of light, even pressure is the big point about this entire video, but anyways, I hope it comes in handy for you, because we do see some things like this occasionally happen, where you get these kind of thicker areas, or the entire image becomes way too thick in terms of the impression pressure that we're using, and maybe in conjunction to how wet our, I don't know, usually our black pads are, or something like that, but it would certainly apply to other colors of ink though. But I don't know, it's usually the black pads or something like that, that we're doing in our main images, in where we run into something potentially like that. So easy ways to avoid it, and this video will hopefully go into that for you and help anyone out that might have run into something of that sort in the past, okay? Okay, this is a video with an aspect of stamping that I've talked about quite a lot in all of my individual videos, but I haven't really done an isolated video dedicated to this aspect of stamping, and that's impression pressure, okay? Now, I don't know, in the majority of the stamping that we will ever do, it's not something that we really have to think about very much, because when it comes to making impressions, a lot of images are fairly equally kind of distributed amongst their design, the mass of the design, okay? So let's take a look at something like this ledge right here, okay? And as I'm stamping it out, I mean, I don't have to really think about kind of my pressure that I'm using. All I have to know is that I'm using adequate pressure to get a good impression and an equal impression across the total area of the stamp, okay? Alright, so we have some good line quality in terms of the size of the dots that I am making impressions of, okay? But even for something like this, if I take this and with, as far as rubber stamping goes and impressions go, let's take this stamp and you can kind of see the edges right here. All of the dot edges are the same in terms of the size of dots as anything on the interior. It's all done with technical pens of the same size, nib size, okay? Alright, but let's take this and let's rock it a little bit, okay? So if I'm rocking it like that, we can kind of see where that dot on the edge got much bigger because I have taken my stamp and before I've lifted it, instead of giving kind of a vertical pressure, you know, straight down, what I've done is I've taken it and I've rocked it like that. So what happens is on the edge of your stamp right here, when we're inking it up, we can get some ink on the side of it just from the very nature of a soft ink pad and the surface of what we're inking up, okay? So not only is it getting a little bit on the side like that, but if I rock that stamp that way, then what I'm doing is I'm, on that total area of stamps over here, I'm kind of squashing them down too, so you're taking this little point of where that little dot is, okay, imagine this is a microscopic view of that, and what I'm doing is I'm taking that and I'm squashing it like this, so instead of just this little tip right here that's making that contact with the paper, you're making that contact, and that results in a much larger dot pattern on the edge of the stamp, okay? Right here it gets a little bit bigger, it kind of condensed all of those dots too, so if all those dots became much bigger and squashier, it kind of fills in there, which you don't want. You want nice light and even pressure over the, you know, across all the surface right here, so watch out for something like that. Okay, now, but that really doesn't come into play too much. Most of us aren't taking our stamps and squashing it like that, okay? I mean, it happens too. But where that really comes into play are designs that are kind of smaller, okay? Where when we're making our impressions, okay, we have a lot more strength with that distribution of pressure because the stamps are so small, okay? So for a large stamp like this, I might be pressing fairly, you know, firmly into it, but all that pressure is getting distributed amongst that surface area right here. It's not the size of the stamp either. If this stamp was just an outline of a circle like that, like a really thin line or something like that, or a word stamp could be really big, but if it's just like some kind of real light script or something like that, the, you know, however much you press into it is going to get distributed amongst that surface area of the design. So it has to do with more surface area than, you know, stamp dimensions, okay? But let's take a look at where that would really come into play. We have something like this little flock of birds, okay? So if I'm taking this right here, I want to use a light, even pressure, okay? And that gives us a perfect impression, okay? But let's take a look at that stamp right there, and let's use the same amount of pressure that I used on something like this, okay? So it's just a really small surface area. Again, it's not just the size of this stamp, but it's the amount of surface area on here, which is very little. It's just those little ducks, okay? So if I use this, and I'm squashing it down, I'm just using vertical pressure right now, and that's what happens right there. What we've done is we've squashed that stamp out, okay? So let's do a little bit of squashing and rocking of the stamp, okay? So I'm doing that, and I'm just squashing it. I'm kind of doing it in extreme. I'm really trying to work it in, but we can see what that'll result in, okay? So just light, even pressure, and you get a perfect impression, okay? Let's take a look at something like this. This one's really kind of an extreme notion of this pressure, okay? So we have this little line right here that's a rod, fishing rod, okay? Where I'm going to use most of my pressure, though, is right on the body right here, okay? Right on the figure, okay? I don't want to put too much pressure up here, otherwise it's going to squash, so light, even pressure. And that rod is perfectly thin, okay? Now let's just do this again. But let's squash that top a little bit. And we have a much larger fishing pole, right? Alright, let's do it again, but let's use even more pressure up there, like that, okay? Look at that. It becomes like this huge kind of a strange device that doesn't even look like this fishing rod anymore. Alright, now this right here, this is kind of a reed stamp right here, and we have these very thin, kind of graceful little things where they kind of taper off, okay? Now that's what we want on something like this. We want it to taper off nicely, okay, on the top. So where's most of the mass of this? I'm holding it right down here, okay, and I'm getting a good even pressure, and we get these nice thin reeds like that, okay? But now let's take it again, like this, but now let's kind of push, you know, on the top and bottom, and then you get this kind of flattening out, squashing out, because this is rubber right here. And if you're compressing that into something like that, what you're doing is you're taking that thin line where it's kind of doing that, and you get this thing where it's starting to smash out, okay? Which would represent way too much pressure up there, okay? So you just go like this. I mean, you can do it however many times you want, and it'll give you some nice, even, and thin impressions, okay? Now, also, what comes into play is how much ink you're using. Let's say I'm using a VersaFine or something like that. It's known for, you know, being fairly thick. It's very fine, but it's also very thick ink, okay? Let's do something like this. I can get a good straight impression of it like that, but let's say I kind of use way too much pressure on the top again. And you can see how much more extreme that is just because it has more ink on it, okay? So that's like that one right there. But if you use more ink to begin with, what happens is, you know, the more you smash into it, the more that ink starts spreading out like that on the top. And you'll get something like that. So, like I said, this doesn't come into play with most of your designs, but any type of design that's going to have some kind of isolated perimeter details on it that would require kind of, you know, being a little bit more careful about using too much pressure. These are the types of things that you have to consider when making that that impression. Let's take a look at this one right here. It's kind of a little bit more of an extensive kind of version of this right here. There's a little bit more support though on this in the interior right in here because we have all these perimeter birds as well, but let's give that one a try here. Okay, light, even pressure. So I go like this, and I usually put my finger in the middle like that, and we get crisp, beautiful little impressions of those ducks. The definition of the wings are fine. All right, let's do it in the VersaFine. The VersaFine's like one of the thickest, you know, inks you can possibly use, right, for something like this. But if you use light, even pressure like that, now you don't want to use so light, you know, pressure that you don't get, you know, something doesn't stamp out. Don't be. It's not some kind of like gingerly process or something like that where it's like, I don't want to stamp too much, you know what I mean, or something like that, and then you don't get any impression at all. Here's glossy paper, by the way. Here's, you can do it on matte paper, okay? Just light, even pressure, okay? Same thing goes for something like this. The most extreme one, I would say, is something like this. Little fishing pole, excuse me. Okay, so something like that. Alright. This is on the matte side of this cardstock right here, but let's go and use too much pressure. Okay. There you have, I don't know, whatever it is. It's not a, I don't know, maybe fishing for sharks or something like that, you know, with this gigantic rod or something like that. But let's take a look at a couple of other designs where impression pressure can really come into play as far as the correct pressure. Okay, this one's the sedge filler right here. It's a really good filler image for all of your grassy textures. It's a fairly evenly distributed dot pattern style of stamp, okay? But even so, this perimeter area right here is one where you want things to fill in nicely and blend together nicely, okay? So light, even pressure, all right? Say something like this. Let's say I'm doing a little hill or meadow or whatever. So we get something like this. All the perimeter dots are all of the same quality. Let me just flip this one. I'll use the same piece of paper here. But let's say I use this a little bit too much and I rock it, okay? Then you get that type of thing going on, okay? Where you get dot patterns starting to fill in, but you see that top portion right there where I've taken this and I've rocked it a little bit, so I've squished it, you know. I've got a much harder edge like that. Let me do it again. Okay, you can see like that. I'll just kind of stamp it like that, and I'll rock it a little bit. See that little angle that I did? And then see what happens there is it gets that kind of more squashed top, okay? Now I'll tell you what, this is what happens though in scenic stamping quite a bit. Let's say we're stamping out large stamps like something like this, okay? Because usually that's kind of the it's kind of the methodology we use. We usually don't do like you know, some small stamp like this and we build a scene around it. I mean, you certainly could, but usually it's the structure of the composition that we're doing. So we're doing something like this. I actually stand up to get leverage, you know, when making my large impressions. Okay, so I'm going top, left, right, middle, bottom, and I do that a couple times. And I'm stamping on kind of a stack of paper as well. Alright, so we're doing something like that. And then let's say, I don't know, we have another one over here. I mean, even like a large stamp like this, you want to be careful that you don't squash and rock this stamp, you know, where the top portions of this become, you know, kind of squashed. Let's go with it for a couple impressions of this. Alright, so we have a lot of surface area of these stamps like that. I'm pressing, allowing that ink to transfer onto my cardstock here. And then let's say, for example, like on a lot of these videos where I'm you know, coloring in these scenes and so forth and whatnot. And then let's say we get down to the end figure in here, okay? We've gone through and we've used some large stamps on here, so we kind of develop this muscle memory of how much pressure to use on our stamp. But now, let's go down and we're going to put a little fisherman in the scene or something like that, okay? It's a much smaller stamp. There's a lot less surface area to this one than this one. This one also has this little fishing rod coming out like that right there, okay? So that would be the area kind of most prone to potentially squishing that part of the design. And then we go like this, and then if we're pressing and pressing and pressing, and it's easy to kind of rock this stamp too. And maybe we have some different colors of ink on here, some blues and stuff like that, so it's almost like you're stamping wet into wet. And then if you rock it too much or something like that, or we're using the same amount of pressure, and then you get this kind of squashed figurine in there, okay? Especially with this, I don't know, it looks like a baseball bat instead of this rod, where it should have been like this, just this light, even pressure. It's not a delicate, you know, real matter. I mean, you just want to give it even pressure. You know, there's not some kind of like, you know, really small window sweet spot or something like that. You want to give it adequate pressure, but you just don't want to go extreme like that and then get something like that, okay? So, again, just take that, even pressure, don't rock it at all, and you get a good impression every time. All right? So kind of watch your pressure and keep it nice and even, and don't rock your stamps.